I'm essentially going to talk very quickly, because we've got 7 minutes, about 5 projects which are, in one way or another, different versions of circularity. I think they're all really fascinating. They're all ones that I've been involved with. None of them are the Olympics, which I could talk about for a long time, and none of them are to do with Old Oak or Park Royal, where I'm the sustainability director at the moment, which is a 25,000 home development. But here we go. The first one is oil and gas decommissioning. 1.5 billion worth of oil rigs are being decommissioned every year, and that stuff is being smelted, huge waste. One is another project I did with Zero Waste Scotland on the Orkney Islands. A third is Baker Street, where we were the structural engineers, youthful projects and expedition engineering. A fourth one, Stockton Bridge, similarly a structural engineering project I was involved with, and then some policy work I've been doing for the GLA. So oil and gas rig decommissioning. There's a vast array of different types of oil and gas rigs that are currently being decommissioned in the North Sea. The industry's worth about, the deconstruction industry, about 1.5 billion a year. To build a rig is about 2 billion, to disassemble is about 200 million, and they're getting about 2 million worth of salvage scrap, which is completely crazy. The value of these products are much higher. So we did some work with Zero Waste Scotland to look at exactly what's in a rig, and which components could be reused, given that we know that this material is coming out. It's coming out regularly for the next 20 years. So it's a known supply chain. At the moment, it's ending up in somewhere like Santander or in Bangladesh, where it's being scrapped. This is the sort of way in which these amazing trawlers are coming and dismantling these rigs, taking them down to be smelted. There's lots of fantastic, valuable steel in here. But you also have all sorts of other products, like these chains, these enormous chains, which are just being smelted. You know, massive value. There are whole energy systems that sit on these rigs, which could be providing CHP for small towns. There's a whole bunch of different products. So we spent some time with 13 engineers and designers from different industries to look at all the products, 24 of the products in those rigs that we felt could be reused. We came up with 186 ideas in a couple of hours that could be, for products that could be reused across 12 different sectors, including floating rigs for turbines, to sheds for agricultural industry, pipe, really high value pipe for the water industry. We looked at the kind of issues that are preventing that from happening. So what's in that rig, a pre-landing audit, to how do you remove it, to the assessments of the products, the quality of the products, how do you decontaminate and check those materials, what's required in testing and certification so you can reuse them, and then how do you actually take those to market. We did this piece of work, and we essentially ended up with one silver bullet to really make this happen. Following Brent Spar, the government said that rigs had to be taken out and smelted or effectively recycled. If you just require, government says, and actually 50% of all the product in those rigs has to be reused, you create an industry overnight worth, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds, and creating hundreds of jobs that are being lost at the moment in Scotland. So very, very simple advice that we provided. Really interesting piece of work, and it's written up on Zero Waste Scotland's website. We did a similar piece of work on the Orkney Islands, looking at the bioeconomy. Really interesting. So there's a bunch of products that are made in the Orkneys: beef, salmon, distillery hops, fishing, ice cream, etc., cheese. They also have a massive surplus of renewable energy, wind turbines, with no interconnector to the mainland. So they have to switch these things off when the wind blows. Completely sort of bizarre. And actually what's really interesting is that they're importing 2 real main products: manure and feed and oil. The oil and diesel is being used in farming, for ferries, and for vehicles. The farmers could be taking the manure and turning it in through AD into a fuel. They could cut that out, and the diesels could be using the hydrogen to the renewables to produce hydrogen as a fuel. So there's masses they could do to win for easy wins around the circular economy. So we essentially looked at that value chain, looked at all the products, the byproducts that they're generating, which are actually polluting things like the rivers and the lochs, which is where the fish come from, etc. Looked at what they could be doing around livestock waste, brewing waste, etc., crab waste. We looked at a number of different technologies that you could use to reuse those materials, the products that you could then generate, which would generate real value for the economy and massively reduce the externalities. Effectively a big mass balance study looking at an island economy, which in a sense is kind of looking at a city economy, very sort of similar. But that process of mass balance, looking at the ins, what's flowing in, what you do with it, how you process it, and then what's flowing out is really fascinating. Something else we've done on Old Oak and Park Royal. And then we, much smaller project, but 55 Baker Street was a government building. There was a competition for designers to knock this down and put a new building in its place. We went into that competition as Expedition Engineering with Hopkins. We took this building here, which was going to be demolished, and we convinced the developers, actually you could completely reuse this. This is a new plinth, concrete foundations that we held this building up on, and that's created new shops, new mixed-use development, really successful piece of development. Similarly, we took this bridge, which is goes across the T in Stockton. Here is a steelworks on this side, which is sort of slowly sort of closing. We designed the bridge so every component could be made in that steelworks, creating local jobs. But we also used, for example, these piles, which came out of the oil and gas industry, as the foundations for that bridge. So lots of recycled content in that building. There's all sorts of things you can do if you're innovative, and if you think about this as a sort of value proposition. It doesn't happen unless the client and unless designers begin to really ask for it. But there's a huge amount of value that can be had through recycling at scale in really interesting ways. And then finally, I've been working over the last 6 months with the GLA to design their circular economy statement guidance. So the GLA is going to be the first council in the UK, probably the first in the world, that is going to ask through the planning process that all major projects must produce a circular economy statement. It won't tell them what they have to do with circular economy. Big projects will have to start thinking about the circular economy. They'll have to start thinking from across the whole development process how they're going to approach at strategic levels and at practical levels the circular solutions, and they'll have to present those. There's a number of principles that we've sort of developed with them. They're kind of well understood around circularity, defining what it kind of actually means, from long life, loose fit, low carbon development from an architectural perspective, to building with flexibility, to building for disassembly and reassembly. I think it fits very much into the kind of models that we've just been looking at. And then it says, how do you apply those principles to each layer of the building? And what we're really saying is start thinking about this, developers, start thinking about this, designers. Think about at different sort of scales what you can do from a structure, from a facade, from the M&E and the services perspective. What can you do from a space perspective, so the kind of internal walls, and what can you do from the bathrooms and kitchens, etc. Who do you have to partner with? How might you approach those? Come up with lots of ideas, and then focus on a few things you really want to kind of deliver. So that's what the statement's going to require. There's a very structured way of reporting against that. We've developed a sort of series of tools for thinking through that. Do you have an existing building or not? Is it technically, if yes, is it technically and financially viable to reuse it? We're knocking down far more buildings than we really ought to be. You know, in London, in the centre of London, office buildings are lasting about 30 years. In New York, about 80 years. So why is that happening? Why aren't we designing for flexibility? Could we make better use of those buildings? If yes, you know, how can you design? How can it be functionally sort of changed in order that it's repurposed, etc.? So we want people to start thinking through that process. Simply, if it can't be, then what can you recover? And if there isn't an existing building, then what can you do to begin to reuse it? So we're actually just asking developers through the planning process to begin to kind of really question what they're doing with materials and products and an approach at the very beginning of the process. So thank you very much. That's